We're so glad this final talk is Michael Thompson from the University of New Hampshire. And Michael, you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys.
You're welcome.
Well, it's really great to be here with this last hurrah. It's also really exciting to see, as Sage ended her talk, a whole bunch of people filed in. It made me feel special that people come to my last talk here. For those of you who are here for Sage's talk, she talked a lot about forestry and the North Woods and things. And we're going to kind of continue that a bit in this talk, where my work as a master's that I finished this past fall, and now as I'm working as a research scientist, looking at the impacts of economic forest degradation on avian functional diversity. So briefly here, actually before I jump into our brief things, for those, because I know this is forest, so we're in a big fun birding thing, there's a lot of pictures of birds on here. So there are trees, sorry, but there are birds, and there are a lot of fun birds. And as you go, feel free, I have a list of how many bird species I have on there, so see if you can get all of them as you go.
Big challenge.
So what I'll do here is starting off, just a quick overview here. So all of my work has been done in the northern New England region, which is really heavily forested. And what this does is it influences how important timber markets are to that region. And it also influences the diversity of wildlife we see up there. And the reason why I bring this up is because land managers that are in these regions need to really work hard to balance both of those things. In an ideal world, would we just say, never cut forests and let them go and wildlife would kind of regrow? Absolutely. However, we live on a planet with like 9 billion people, and we have to kind of acknowledge this aspect of we need timber. We are all sitting in a building that is in part made by wood. So acknowledging that is really important, and land managers work really hard to try and balance these two things. So my research had a lot of objectives here, but this is the 20-minute version, so we're only going to talk about 2 of them today. The first was just to assess the relationship between overall functional diversity of birds and these bird communities in economically degraded forests. The second objective we're going to look at today is looking to compare functional diversity response to degradation among specific ecosystem functions of seed dispersal, pest control, and nutrient cycling. So I've mentioned degradation. Sage in the last talk also mentioned the Betts paper that talks about degradation. There are a lot of ways that we would categorize a forest as degraded. In this context, we're looking at it as an economically degraded forest. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the FAO uses this definition where they say a forest is degraded in which one that has reduced capacity to supply forest products. So ideally, this is kind of what we're looking at when we're talking about an economically degraded forest. And to kind of categorize and define these, we use 3 important variables. The first of which is tree species composition. And we look at this more specifically, we're looking at the composition of species by timber value. So things like white pine and sugar maple might be are really valuable, high value species. Eastern hemlock and red maple are moderately valuable. And then things like American beech and balsam fir are low value species. The second thing we look at is what's called tree quality. So we have acceptable growing stock or unacceptable growing stock, AGs and UGs, we call them. An AG, as an acceptable growing stock tree, would be a tree that could produce at least an 8-foot saw log, meaning a log that's nice and straight without any defects in it that we could use for something like this, right? An unacceptable growing stock, or affectionately named an UGS, would be a tree like this. This is one of our field sites here. We have a really great example of an AGS here. It's big white pine. And this was a really awesome situation where they decided to grow right next to each other to really give me this really great example of an AGS on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side here, this would be a great example of an UGS where we have a lot of knots. We have this big deformation right here. And so that would be an unacceptable tree. And then lastly, we look at what's called relative density. So simply put, this is just a way of measuring the density of trees to look at canopy closure. And now we use relative density to develop a threshold or a cutoff point of when we are 10 years from a fully closed canopy. So with these 3 methods and this relative density, we try to categorize our forests into these 5 different degradation categories. Now this dotted line here is what I was talking about with that threshold, that 10 years from canopy closure. And what we're trying to show here is that in category 1, in order to reach that threshold, you only need to really include the most valuable trees that are acceptable growing stock. So you're category 1 if you are fully white pine, or if you are sugar maple and yellow birch. These are really high value trees that are all nice acceptable growing stock. You can cross that threshold when we only include those. If, however, we're in a forest where we can't only include those, and now we need to include our second most valuable growing stock species, then we would be considered category 2. So you can see if we only counted the most valuable, we don't reach that threshold, but when we count the second most valuable and the first most, now we're crossing that threshold. So these are what would be called undegraded forests, these first and second categories. From here on out, these are what we would consider economically degraded forests. So category 3 would be, let's include any species, doesn't matter the timber value of that, but we still are only looking at trees that can have saw logs. So we aren't including these unacceptable growing stock species. And do we cross that threshold? Now, if we still don't cross that threshold, well, now let's just include all trees. We don't care what species, we don't care what growth form, we're including everything. If now we can cross that line, we're category 4. And if we include the entire forest or the entire patch we're looking at, and we still don't cross that threshold, well, then we would be in category 5. Now, it's worth noting in this work that I have here, I only have categories 1 through 4. And in part, that is because when we're talking about category 5 forests, we're not talking about shrublands and young forests, right? If we have a shrubland or a young forest, or an early successional forest, we might not reach that canopy closure level. That's just because that forest is growing up. And so it can be pretty tricky to find those category 5s. And they often more are things like really dense beech thickets with very few sparse to larger trees in between. So in our study, we only have our categories 1 through 4 here. But this is still a really important thing across New England. There was some work done by John Gunn and colleagues that actually showed using forest inventory analysis data that nearly half of our northern New England forests are economically degraded. And they might be things like this lower left hand where we actually have this kind of heavy clear cut. It happens to be that this is one of the few clear cuts that I would consider a category 5 just because I know the person who cut it. And in his words, it was, quote, a liquidation. So I would say this is a high grade and very much in that category 5. But it might be something like a structural degraded forest where, yeah, we have dense structure here, but all of the stuff that's here is either not saw logs or poor species. And similar here, we have a really dense beech thicket. And those of you who may have seen Grace McCullough's talk, this is Grace's hand breaking the wood right there, poking up in that thicket. So we've talked a bit about trees. Why are we using birds to look at this functional response? Well, they're really sensitive to habitat change first. They respond quickly when things come through and cuts happen. They also are vastly abundant and have a diverse set of ecologies. And they're really easy to survey. You simply need a pen, a paper, some knowledge, and a pair of binoculars. And they lastly provide some really critical ecosystem functions. So I've mentioned functional diversity. That's not a widely understood term, so we're going to explain it here a little bit. Taxonomic diversity is just what you would typically think of when you think of diversity. It's how many species and what's the distribution of abundance of those. But in our little example community here, where our different colors are our different species, we might have a specific taxonomic diversity. But when we look at the functions, it might be that we have a lower functional diversity than we do taxonomic, because maybe our yellow and green species play the same function as each other, whereas blue and purple species might be unique or different functions. So it's really important to kind of look at what are the functions that these species play. And how are we actually learning this? How are we can't go up and just ask, hey, what do you do in the forest, right? So we have to figure out ways to actually measure these different functions. We use a method called trait-based functional diversity, which uses what are called functional traits. So the idea is they could be morphological, something like wing length or bill shape might influence how that bird moves and the functions it plays in its ecosystem. It might also be behavioral, where that bird is nesting, what is a foraging strategy, or how do they forage? Things like this all influence those. So by using these functional traits, we can then see how they influence the ecosystem functions that we talked about a little earlier. And then eventually we want to be able to say, okay, how are these different functions influencing and feeding back into the ecosystem services that we all have and use, things like timber or greenhouse gas mitigation, or even something like wildlife recreation, which is a really important ecosystem service. So when we measure functional diversity, what we're doing here is if we have a little plot and we have our species as different rows and we get a wing length and the bill shape of all of our species, we can then take those and plot them in what's called trait space, where we might have bill shape on the x-axis and wing length on the y, and we can look at where species fall within this trait space. So on the lower left, we have a little red-eyed vireo here. On the upper right, we have an American kestrel. And you can see those two are very far apart from each other because functionally they play very different roles. The size of the dot here just represents the abundance of that species. Now in this example, I only have 2 traits. When we are actually doing this work, I have a matrix of like 27 traits, but visually representing 27-dimensional space is pretty challenging. So I've just showed you 2 here. So once we have our species plotted in this trait space, there's a lot of ways that you can actually measure functional diversity, and we picked 3. The first of which is what's called functional dispersion. All this is the average distance of all of those species to the center of that group. So we're looking at the spread of species in this trait space. So we might have high functional dispersion on the left, and low functional dispersion on the right in these examples, where on the right we have all of our species are really clumped up. And low dispersion might result in fewer available niches, and we show underutilized resources in that community. The second method we looked at, or second metric we looked at, is called functional divergence. We use that same average distance to the center, which is that red circle there, and now we're more interested in what is the proportion of species that hold extreme functions, that hold functions on the outside or outside that edge of the average distance to the center. So we have high on the left, and again, low functional divergence on the right. And that functional divergence shows poor niche differentiation, meaning there's not a lot of separation between the jobs that those species might play, and resulting in high resource competition. When we have species that are really clustering here, they're probably going to be competing for resources that are much heavier. And then lastly, we looked at what's called functional evenness. So this is just the spread of species across the shortest line. So high on the left, again, low evenness on the right, and low functional evenness would show a poor resilience to random events, stochastic events, and a low redundancy. Again, if a hurricane came through and happened to wipe out a resource that a lot of species utilized, and because they're all clumped over here, this might show this like low redundancy. So on to some of our work. We did work in 2 locations. One was in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and the second was in the Bartlett White Mountain National Forest, White Mountain National Forest in Bartlett, excuse me. At each of our locations, we had a number of points where we conducted bird surveys and collected abundance of species, where we counted all the birds within 50 meters that we heard or saw. And we also did a bunch of vegetation surveys where we looked at species and DBH, and again, that ags and UGs to determine on the ground what are our degradation categories. And again, here's a nice picture of Grace. So we talked about traits briefly. So in our main trait matrix, in our main, when we looked at all of our traits for functional diversity, we had 27 total traits gathered from a variety of sources. But then when we wanted to look at the ecosystem functions of these birds, we divided them up into these 3 groups, and we subset them by what traits influence this function. So for a quick example, something like percent diet fruit or percent diet seed here are influencing seed dispersal. So these are traits that when we're looking at this seed dispersal function. So a brief overview of what we found. Well, from a bird composition standpoint in Bartlett, we had just over 2,500 observations and 53 different species. In Mohegan, we had just over 2,800 observations and 64 different species, where our most abundant species were that red-eyed vireo, ovenbird, and then black-throated blue warbler and black-throated green. When we look at the composition again, but this time we're looking at it across these different degradation categories, one of the things that we notice is that on category 1, 2, and 4, the top 2 species are still red-eyed vireo and ovenbird, Whereas when we look at category 3, we actually see a different composition of top most abundant species, and we see this number of 11 unique species that are in category 3 forests. Among all of our categories we had 32 species that shared, that were similar or present in all of those categories. So getting to kind of these objectives, coming back to what we wanted to look at, assessing the relationship between overall avian functional diversity and economic degradation. So when we look at functional divergence, again, this is that average distance to the center, we can see that category 2 and 3 have the highest functional diversity or functional dispersion, and category 1 is the lowest. But really the statistical difference here is only between 1 and 2 and 1 and 3. We don't see that much of a difference between 3 and 4 or 2 and 4. When we move over to divergence and evenness, we actually we lose that statistical significance. There's no significant difference between any of our categories when we're looking at either birds with extreme traits or when we're looking at that spread of species across that line. And then what's important here is this is when we're only looking at all of our traits combined. If we were to then break it out and say, okay, well, how are they different when we look at actually the ecosystem functions? This is our same functional dispersion on the top, and this purple is our all traits. And when we move over to look at the traits that influence nutrient cycling or pest control or seed dispersal, the main takeaway here that I want to talk about is the fact that the categories that are the highest, that are statistically different, are different depending on what ecosystem function we're looking at. So when we look at nutrient cycling, 3 has the highest dispersion, whereas when we look at pest control, category 2 has the highest. And when we're looking at seed dispersal, again, 3 is, but there's a lot more difference between all of our groups. And when we look at our other 2 metrics, we actually, again, see no statistical difference between these first 3 categories, and only have a statistical difference when we look at seed dispersal again. So there is this question of what is powering this, and a lot of that gets into the 40-minute version of this talk where I talk about structure and why that might be. But some of the takeaways that I can give you here from this version is the first being that this relationship between economic degradation and functional diversity is nonlinear. And I think one of the reasons that's really important to think about is we can't just say, oh, cut your forests or manage your forests so that we have the most valuable forests, economically valuable forests, and the least economically degraded, because then that's better. Or we can't do the reverse. Make sure you don't cut for the most economically valuable, because then that's better. So it's important to show that categories 2 and 3 are really the high, and we haven't said this unimodal distribution, where if we have a really degraded forest on one hand and a really undegraded forest on the other, neither of them show really high functional diversity. And part of this, again, I can answer questions after, has probably to do with beach and its influence here. But the second aspect that I want to have a takeaway is that it's really important to investigate these ecosystem functions separately. If we were to try and draw conclusions about nutrient cycling or pest control or seed dispersal and only using this all traits matrix, then we're going to really lose some of these details that we see when we break them out. So it's really important to look at this from a separate standpoint. So lastly, some future work that we want to look at. One of them is the same exact study, but instead of with birds, looking at the functional diversity of plants and mammals, and do they follow a similar trend that we see in birds? And then also, how are the ecosystem services of timber production and carbon sequestration being impacted by this economic degradation? So here I get at ecosystem functions, but we haven't really looked directly at these services that are happening. And adding to this, it might be really interesting to look at what are the cultural services that are being influenced, like wildlife recreation. That one tends to be really tricky because how you define cultural ecosystem services is very complicated, especially if you want to quantify it. So with that, I just want to thank some of the collaborators on this project, as well as my old lab, and definitely my field technicians, Grace McCullough, who is talking today, Chase Cody, Mark Troiani, and Atticus Soren, and then also the different sponsors and resource staff that we worked with at the U.S. Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service as well as UNH. So with that, I will take any questions.